I do want to talk with you, Dr. Hafer, for a little bit here because I want to talk about your book that you wrote. So you wrote a book, and it's really interesting. It's called "The Not So Intelligent Designer: Why Evolution Explains the Human Body and Intelligent Design Does Not." Because we've dabbled in intelligent design here on this program, and I want to know because I wasn't somebody who really grew up with a lot of that apologetics, and a lot of people who watch this show, some of them are, some of them aren't. So everything I had to learn about intelligent design was through my deconstruction process of hearing other people's arguments for it. And to be honest, a lot of it was never really convincing to me. But part of it is because I never grew up on this stuff. So, what is your book about? And, what do you talk about in your book as like the main points against intelligent design, not intelligence design. That's different.
Right. Well, just to give you a little bit of background, when I was a graduate student in zoology and biology in California, this was in the early 1980s, I was absolutely astounded because, when I was in college and in high school, it was just assumed that, everybody understood or acknowledged evolution. Maybe a few people here and there in pockets of the US didn't, but by and large, it was assumed that everybody accepted evolution. But then when I was a graduate student in the early 1980s, it astounded me that in Los Angeles, there were school committees or school boards that were talking about accepting what was then called scientific creationism and have that taught in public schools as science. And I was just astounded. I mean, we are now not talking the backwoods of someplace. We are talking about Los Angeles, a major metropolitan area. And there were these school boards that were deciding to accept the teaching of what was then called scientific creationism. And I thought this was crazy, but I was a grad student. I really didn't have any power or anything like that. So there wasn't much I could do about it, but it bothered me and astounded me. So I went off and I got my DPhil. And I came back and discovered that the problem had not gone away. It had changed a little bit. It was now called intelligent design. But this is your first clue. That was it was in 1987 when the courts declared that creationism is a religious doctrine. And basically, on the day that the court decided that, the people who had been pushing creationism discovered intelligent design. So that kind of tells you what's going on here. Intelligent design is just a strategic rebranding of creationism. So anyway, I was back in the US and I was busy, getting jobs and doing work and the usual things that you do. And the problem didn't go away. There was one time when I was talking to some friends about this, and a couple of things became clear during that conversation. And one was that there are a lot of people who want to support accepting evolution, but they don't know enough about biology to know how to do it. And there are a lot of biologists even who are just not good at, saying things in simple terms. The reality is that we have libraries full of evidence for evolution, and most people don't know it. And this is a problem for scientists because it really means that in this particular regard, doing more research won't make a difference because the problem is getting the information to other people. And we're talking about educated people. A friend of mine is an engineer, and he asked me, when are we going to have enough information to just, bury intelligent design? And I said, we've got it. We've had it for decades, hundreds of years even. And he just didn't know it. And why should he? He's not a biologist. But this kind of pointed up what the problem was. But then he also asked, well, so, why is this even an issue? And the answer is because it's political. And this set off major alarms in my head because I've worked on political campaigns, and political arguments are different. Political arguments have to be short, easy to understand, easy to repeat, and preferably entertaining. So it's a very different way of speaking than what most scientists are taught to do. We are taught to not just be objective, but if we're presenting our research, we are expected to present our results, give our interpretation, and then stand back. You're actually not supposed to be invested in the outcome of your own research. It's hard to do, but that's the standard. Not everybody reaches it, but the point is that's the standard. So we are not taught to be advocates. It's really not our training at all. In fact, it's the opposite of our training. So anyway, I gave myself an assignment to try and figure out what a political style argument for evolution would even look like. What would it sound like? I had no idea. So I just kind of put it on the back burner as something to think about. And in my daily life, I teach human anatomy and physiology. I've been doing this for years. And so there was one day when we were doing reproductive systems, and I had just drawn the male reproductive system on the board. And I had drawn the testicles outside the abdomen as they are. And so, and I said, the testes hang outside the abdomen. And I asked the class if anybody knew why. There's usually somebody who does. And sure enough, somebody knew the answer. And the answer is that because the testes have to be slightly cooler than normal body temperature in order to produce viable sperm. So I turned around and I was writing this on the board. And as I was writing this on the board, I had this moment of inspiration where I just looked at that and I said, that's really bad design.
Yeah.
Who thought of that?
Right.
And at that point, I realized I had my first best argument against intelligent design in the human body, because once you start talking about men's testicles, people pay attention. And it works every time. And it's a great political style argument because it's true. There is really no design reason why men's testes should hang outside the body. It is true that normal body temperature is too hot for sperm production, but let's face it, that's bad design. Lots of other animals have internal testes, both cold-blooded animals where you can see how that would be, but there are also lots of warm-blooded animals, some of which have body temperatures higher than ours that still have internal testes. So it's not a case that the problem is insoluble, it's just that human men got a bad deal. And
yeah, and these kinds of things too, it's important to point out when people point out reasons. Oh, well, the reason why this is the way it is because X, Y, and Z. No, it doesn't matter, because if you're talking about a god who can design it any way you want, it doesn't have to be there. Like, look, if we lived in a world where every single day there was like a 1% chance everybody's heads could catch on fire, we would say, well, that's a bad design, and it didn't have to be there. And if somebody said, well, the reason why our heads catch on fire is because it helps regulate our body temperature. No, it doesn't. Like, look, we live in a world right now where that doesn't happen. If we can conceive of that, then it could be designed, right? And we're just human beings. If God is even so much greater than us, then why does that even matter? So anyway, yeah, it is kind of, it's a funny thing to point out, but you're right, it does grab people's attention for sure.
Oh, yeah. And we're talking about the creator of the universe here. You would think that he could make body temperature and sperm production compatible.
Yeah, for sure. Or like, here's something I've wondered too. Like if like, it sounds so awful, but like, children can become pregnant, right? Like human children can become pregnant. Why? Why should anybody become pregnant when they aren't willing or just don't want to, or aren't emotionally mature enough to handle a situation like that, right? Like
or
in a
aren't
perfect world,
physiologically able, right?
or physiologically able, right? Like in a perfect world, I don't like people should not be getting pregnant until like I don't know older than 14, in my opinion. Maybe that's a hot take, but I don't think that should be a thing. And yet, people are capable of doing that, and I don't think that's a great design choice personally. But hey, there's no accounting for taste, right?
Right, but
Yeah,
there are lots of fun things about this kind of thing because I mean,
yeah,
think about it. Elephants have internal testes. So, and rhinoceroses. So, why is it that these great, big, strong animals got internal testes, whereas the much more vulnerable human males actually have their testes hanging outside, making them still more vulnerable? I mean, is this fair?
yeah,
And birds all have internal testes, and their body temperatures are higher than ours. So, you know, this also brings up the whole question of God made who in his image. Um,
mm,
and then there's the really fun thing, which are animals like rats and mice have what I call convertibles, which is to say that the testes can hang outside the body if they want to make sperm, but they can be pulled up inside the body if they, you know, need to protect themselves. And so, you know, imagine how useful this would be for human beings. You could control your fertility that way, in
yeah,
addition to protecting yourself. Did we get
right.
that? No.
Yeah, other animals can do that, and I've it's weird explaining that to other people, but like, yeah, like it doesn't have to be the way that it is, and yet here we are, and I don't know,
And yet here we are.
it is pretty
Right.
wild. Here we are, but it's all part of the plan. It's all part of the plan. So
Ah, right.
we don't know what
Right.
the plan is, but it's part of the plan. So you know, anyway, yeah. So that's really interesting. So yeah, this project of trying to make political arguments as opposed to scientific arguments is interesting. You know, it's a rhetorical strategy almost because, and as you point out, in response to into a political movement that's again been happening in this country for decades. Anybody who is familiar with like the old old creationism stuff that you don't hear us talk about anymore, but like the wedge issue stuff, you know, people talking about actual political strategies to get this kind of curriculum taught in schools to promote this alternative view of intelligent design that again you don't see in other parts of the world, but is unique to the American school system. And it's really frightening because I don't want that. One, I mean, it's one thing to have an alternate view of the world. It's another thing to have it taught in a public school space, especially in a part of the world where people are already skeptical to science and are already skeptical to the findings thereof. They're just going to say, "Oh, I like this idea better, so I'm just going to run with this." And kind of forget everything else. You know, I'm lucky to be a part of a great school system in my area that actually gave me a really good education on evolution. Because before I talked about it with my friends, they didn't know what it was, but they knew that they were against it because how could we come from monkeys? That doesn't make any sense. So people already have to fight against these opinions that are already out there. And a lot of misinformation. I mean, a ton of misinformation. If I went outside of my place here and I gathered 10 people on the street and asked them to explain to me what evolution is, I'm willing to bet like 3 people would actually get like a scientifically valid definition. I really think
Mhm.
it's that low. People just don't really understand it. So I'm fascinated by this thing you're doing to make these arguments more political. So what are some other examples that you found in doing this project?
Well, and I mean, you know, just to give equal time, there's also the birth canal. Um,
Yeah.
let me explain a little bit of background here. Your fundamental problem with giving birth as a human female is that we walk upright while being very smart. So we walk on 2 legs. And that means that you actually have to have fairly narrow hips in order to be able to walk reasonably efficiently. If your hips are too wide and you're walking on 2 legs, it gets really awkward if your hips are too wide. So, as I said, we can't have hips that are too wide. On the other hand, we are very smart. Being smart means we have large brains. Large brains mean we have large heads, and large heads mean that the babies have to fit through a circle of bone that is smaller than the head is. And this is why
Mm,
giving birth is so difficult. Um,
mm-hmm.
and these our large-headed babies favor women with wide hips because you can then have a wider birth canal. So this is your kind of fundamental tension. On the one hand, we walk upright. Any woman who could not walk would die in the natural environment. On the other hand, any woman who had hips too narrow would die trying to give birth to a child.
Mm,
So, as I said, the result is this uneasy compromise that does not work very well and indeed is
mm,
fatal in some
mm.
cases.
Oh,
So, as
well,
I
that
said,
there's a very reasonable explanation as to why that happens, Doctor Ray. I mean, it's because Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, and one of her punishments was pain in childbirth. So come on, we can explain that one away. That's just
sure.
common knowledge at this point, right?
Well, but that the beauty there is, of course, that again you've very deliberately made a theological argument there, which does
Yeah,
not belong in a secular court of law. But
right.
that's a very important point. But as I said,
Mm,
let's talk about other animals and why other animals got better deals. The point is,
mm,
it's not impossible for us to do things better. We could do
right.
things the way kangaroos do them, where they give birth to like tiny embryo sized young, which then finish their development in a nice, comfy pouch on the outside of the woman's body that comes equipped with a nipple for nursing. And that would really be a much easier way to give birth as a human female, but we don't do that because we weren't designed.
Huh. We should be more like kangaroos is not a take I thought I would have to be discussing, but I'm intrigued
You
and
asked,
I
you
see the
asked.
argument there. I think so. Yeah, but no, the point at the end of the day is you're right. Like all of this is evidence more or less that we weren't designed, but rather the result of a series of ongoing processes that have been happening for, I mean, billions of years, for periods of time that we can't even begin to fathom. And as a result, there's going to be some, discrepancies there, and reasons why. I mean, like I'm wearing contacts right now. Like people, we're so used to adapting to some of our own, our own misgivings in our design, quote unquote, right? That we often forget how bad we are at doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. So it is kind of funny talking about this with people who do say that, oh, we are designed from something bigger, and there's just no accounting for that. There's just so many problems with that. So I'm really glad that you pointed some of this stuff out.
Yeah,
I do have go ahead.
I was just going to say the standard for an evolved feature is good enough to not cause death before reproduction too much of the time. So you see, that's not
Mm,
a very high standard.
right.
But basically, so long as you don't die before you reproduce, the evolutionary line keeps going. And you don't
Yes.
really get to go back and redo things. It just keeps going forward.
It's
Um,
the circle of life. Anyway, I won't do any more because YouTube copyright. But yes, definitely.